Welcome back for this is screencast number 3 in our look at economic globalization. My name is Alex Wiseman. We have been spending a little time, actually I'm going to go backwards in my slides here, talking about this statement by Wade in his section of the Globalization Reader called Is Globalization Reducing Poverty and Inequality, where he talks about what the neoliberal argument is. And the neoliberal argument is that the distribution of income has become more equal, and that's a result of economic integration between countries. Right? And so we did a little romp through a description of neoliberalism. We looked at some of the characteristics or guiding principles behind the ideology. We looked at some of its classical roots, in particular concentrating on Thomas Jefferson and how his political idea actually influenced some early statements, some early combinations of liberalism and educational development, including education for women, and in his era, remember when we're talking here, slaves in the United States, in America. So it's important to think about this and important to think about the origins of neoliberal agendas and neoliberal ideologies as they relate to economic globalization, but also as they relate to education, because that is kind of where we're coming from. Now, Wade goes on page 188 to talk about then the left's assumption. And he says, the standard left assumption, in contrast to the neoliberal assumption, is that the rich and powerful countries and classes have little interest in greater equity. Consistent with this view, the anti-globalization, or more accurately anti-neoliberal argument, asserts that world poverty and inequality have been rising, not falling, due to forces unleashed by the same globalization. In other words, he's pointing out that the left perspective, and there are many ways to sort of define that, it comes from a lot of different directions, is that the rich and powerful countries and classes, in this case, have no interest in equity. And as a result, poverty and inequality worldwide have been rising. All right. So how does that happen? Or why is that? Well, from a power perspective, and again, we're looking at this primer here, free trade in reality is seen by many around the world as a continuation of those old policies of plunder, whether it is intended to be or not. Now, I know that this is a really simplistic summary of the anti-neoliberal perspective, but I think it's simple, yet it seems to be very accurate. There's a really old book over here called Education as Cultural Imperialism that was written by my old advisor from Stanford University and a very well-known comparative and international education scholar and economist of education, Martin Carnoy. That looked at education as cultural imperialism. And I looked for, I actually have a copy of this book that was, I think, printed in the 80s. And instead of this picture of a locked chain around a child's head, it has a picture of this very smug looking child in a like a pinstripe suit wearing a tie, and it's funny anyway, but it does a nice job of expressing the idea of education as cultural imperialism. What I find interesting is that Martin Carnoy, who's an economist, is chosen to talk about this as cultural imperialism rather than economic imperialism. And maybe he means to combine the two. Like I said, it's an interesting book. It's an older book. It expresses some ideas that maybe he has developed further since then himself, Martin Carnoy, I mean. But it does take this general idea that a power perspective says that free trade or any sort of economic globalization is really a continuation of old imperial policies of plunder. Right? It doesn't necessarily need to be intended. It just is something that exists. And when we talk about globalization and educational equity, we'll get a lot of this sort of a discussion that comes up. Right? So we have this contrast between then the neoliberal and the anti-neoliberal approaches to economic globalization, or the ways that each side understands economic globalization. Now, where Wade comes from next, I think, is a really crucial point, because whichever side you tend to fall on, the thing to realize, and I think this is important for us as a community of scholars within comparative and international education, as well as students and me in this class, is that, as he points out, the debate tends to be conducted on each side as if its case was overwhelming and only an intellectually deficient or dishonest person could see merit in the other's case. Now, I think this perfectly expresses the way that the discourse about economic globalization, especially related to education, has developed. The idea is that it has become polarizing. Right? There is no middle ground. And if you claim to see, some way that both sides can be integrated, or maybe points that represent elements from each side, you're often accused of being intellectually deficient or dishonest. And I think it's important that Wade points this out, that this isn't necessarily the case. It's not necessarily the case. And he does that by looking at four different propositions, which he then talks about. Right? And he does this on pages 190 through 191. And I think they're each worth looking at. And if you haven't, it's very succinct. It's very to the point. He does a couple things. One, let me first of all, we'll go. Proposition 1. World income distribution has become rapidly more unequal when incomes are measured at market exchange rates and expressed in US dollars. So where he's coming from is he's asking, what is the trend of world income distribution? Because that seems to be the crux of this question. Is globalization reducing poverty and inequality or not? And the way to get at that is to look at the income distribution worldwide. Because that's the way that the neoliberal perspective, or the neoliberal groups, and those would be indicated by the World Bank and others, tend to measure whether or not globalization, or economic globalization in particular, is reducing poverty and inequality. And it also seems to be the area where those who critique the neoliberal perspective, the left's perspective, is that they also look at income distribution, and they look at examples of poverty and inequality and growing disparity between certain groups, and they say, well, this isn't, the neoliberals are, back to this one, intellectually deficient or dishonest. Whereas the neoliberal perspective will look at the left and say, well, they're not looking at the right information, so they must be intellectually deficient or dishonest. So what Wade is doing for us is he's saying, look, we can actually look at this in a better way. So world income distribution has become rapidly more unequal when incomes are measured at market exchange rates and expressed in US dollars. So as Wade points out, no one disputes this. No one says that this isn't actually happening. The dispute is how to interpret the data. Right? So that's why we have to be talking about the same measures. Now, this is where the conversation gets a little dry, and I think it's where we lose a lot of people, especially from the more left perspective, because we have to talk about how we're measuring this stuff, and we have to talk about how we're measuring it in kind of a quantitative way. And I realize that that doesn't always sound super fascinating, but it is important to understand. And the way that he decides, and he asserts that it should be talked about, is that gross domestic product incomes should always be adjusted by purchasing power parity adjustments. Right? What this does is it takes a look at the rate at which the currency of one country would have to be converted into that of another country to buy the same amount of goods and services in each of those countries. And a very simple way to think about this is something that The Economist magazine, and you can get to it right here, The Economist magazine calls the Big Mac Index. For better or for worse, McDonald's, the restaurant chain, has spread worldwide. They sell something called a Big Mac, it's a hamburger, worldwide. It is essentially the same product coming from the same company worldwide. So what the economist does is it says, all right, we can look in England and we can look in China and we can see how much a Big Mac costs in each place. And if we, instead of converting currency through the market-based exchange rates, if we just say the Big Mac costs, £2 in England and it costs, 5 yuan in China, right? Then we can say that there is a big difference in the purchasing power parity of the British pound versus the Chinese yuan, right? With one, you can buy a lot more of the other. In other words, you can buy more Big Macs with 5 British pounds than you can with 5 yuan. All right. So it's a more direct way, quite frankly, a more one-to-one sort of way of thinking about how different currencies match up. So if you look at the purchasing power parity, the PPP, purchasing power parity indices for income, you can see this world income distribution has become rapidly more unequal. And what our friend Wade points out is that there are a couple of keys to actually showing how purchasing power parity, I always get that mixed up, differs from country to country. Let's look at Proposition 2. World purchasing power parity income polarization has increased with polarization measured as richest to poorest decile. And what he says is the top 10% of purchasing power, parity power, whatever, income, resides in the countries of North America, Western Europe, and Japan. And the bottom 10% is in African countries where incomes have stagnated or fallen. Okay? And what he says is that this is really important because this polarization of income and income distribution is a really important change, right? And shows that globalization is not reducing poverty and inequality, but is instead perhaps contributing to it. Goes on to proposition number 3. Between country world PPP income inequality has increased since at least 1980 using per capita GDPs, in other words, equal country weights, China equals Uganda, and a coefficient like the Gini for the whole distribution. Now the Gini coefficient is another one we should talk about. It's a measure of inequality. Right? And what he's saying is, hey look, we want to treat each country as a unit of observation if we're interested in seeing how they actually compare to one another. Right? And if we do that, if we treat each country as a unit of observation, if we equally weight them, and remember he's already using this PPP income thing, right? Then we can start to see how this difference between the richest and the poorest countries exists and how it's changed. And we can start to see how world income distribution has become more unequal. Finally, Proposition 4, he says that between country world PPP income inequality has been constant or falling since around 1980s with countries weighted by population. Now, this is a slightly different argument, and it's important to know the difference because, as he points out, this is the argument, or this is the outcome, that the neoliberal argument, as he says, celebrates. The problem is, as he points out, if you take out the countries that have the largest populations, in other words, if you take out China and you take out India, you change the way that poverty and inequality indicators like the PPP income inequality measures, or Gini coefficients even, you change the way that those look. Right? And if you take out China and India, then you can be sure that you will see more evidence of increasing poverty and increasing inequality rather than the opposite. All right, we're going to pause there. It's a lot to think about. We will come back in the next screencast.